I'm Dean Allison, and welcome back to the Hill Update. We start with a report of another alleged attempt at a cover-up by the federal government. This time it's about attempting to cover up sexual misconduct allegations by threatening a whistleblower. The whistleblower is Lieutenant Commander Raymond Trotter, a 21-year veteran of the Royal Canadian Navy. Trotter was approached by a female subordinate on February the 3rd. She shared her story with him about a sexual misconduct perpetuated against her by then-interim Chief of Defense Staff Admiral Art MacDonald. Admiral MacDonald voluntarily stepped down at the end of February as he was to be investigated for what at the time were called unspecific allegations. We now know what those allegations are. Upon attempting to report the allegations to the proper authorities, Lieutenant Commander Trotter seems to have been given the runaround at first. Eventually, the allegations made it to senior bureaucrats and then senior government officials. Shortly after reporting the inappropriate conduct, Trotter received a call from a blocked number. The person on the other side of the phone identified themselves as a senior Canadian Forces officer. Trotter was told that if he were to cooperate with the House of Commons Defense Committee, a committee currently investigating allegations of misconduct in the military, that his military career would be over. The next day, Trotter got another phone call from a private number. This time, the person identified themselves as a senior member of the Canadian government. This person also told Lieutenant Commander Trotter that the information he would be providing the Defense Committee would be detrimental to his future in the Canadian Forces. Again, this is all happening as the Defense Committee is currently investigating allegations of misconduct in the military relating to former Chief of Defense Staff General Jonathan Vance. Based on the threatening phone calls from private numbers, this certainly looks to be some sort of coordinated campaign to threaten and silence a sexual misconduct whistleblower. So who is behind this? I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Members of Parliament on the Defense Committee will hopefully get to the bottom of it. But what's most important to remember is that this is our country, and we ask an awful lot of Canadian women who serve in our armed forces. In return, our country has a duty to protect those who have sworn an oath to protect us all. To anonymously threaten a member of the Canadian Armed Forces to secure their silence is a clear and concerning abuse of power. The facts need to come out, and when they do, I'll be sure to share them with you here. Now on to the second item of this week's Hill Update. As many of you know, there are now 5 COVID-19 vaccines approved for use in Canada. One of those is made by Pfizer. What came to light in the beginning of this week was that Pfizer was not consulted prior to the recommendation by the NACI, or the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, to extend the advised time between the first shot and the second shot from 3 weeks to 4 months. NACI's recommendation actually sets a new precedent in the delay between doses and goes against the schedule of every other country in the world. Cole Pinnell, Pfizer Canada's president, said that this plan goes against Pfizer's guidance for optimal, safe, and effective use of the vaccine. He said that the National Advisory Committee on Immunization did not contact Pfizer before it recommended delaying the second dose from 3 weeks to 4 months after the first shot, and that this recommendation creates concern, confusion, and potentially hesitancy. He goes on to say that all of the research to date is with patients that have received doses 21 days apart, that the NACI is the only advisory body given the federal government in the world to be recommending that doses be permitted up to 4 months apart. The opposition Conservatives have stated that they want the government to succeed in getting COVID-19 vaccines to Canadians, but like the president of Pfizer, they're concerned that the Liberal government's inability to explain their decision-making could lead to further vaccine hesitancy. Also, when asked about whether partial immunity from a 4-month delayed second dose creates conditions for vaccine-resistant strains to emerge, experts expressed concerns. At this time, the Liberal government has yet to tell Canadians how they plan to prevent this in our country, given that their new advice is not backed by data. When we come back from break, I'm going to be joined by my colleague Marilyn Gladu, the Member of Parliament for Sarnia-Lambton since 2015. We're going to talk about Line 5. And prior to her becoming a Member of Parliament, she was an engineer at Dow Chemical and Suncor. When we come back from the break, we'll be talking to Marilyn. Joining me on today's show is Marilyn Gladu, the Member of Parliament for the riding of Sarnia-Lambton. Marilyn, thanks for joining me on the show today. A lot of talk about Line 5, and I know you've been a big champion for Line 5. I know you've spoken about it in the House, you've done petitions, but a lot of people don't really even understand what Line 5 is, unfortunately. Would you just give us an overview of what Line 5 is and why it's important to us?
Sure, Dean, and thanks for having me today. Line 5 brings crude oil from the west and comes down through Wisconsin, where there is oil processing happening, back on through the Straits of Mackinac into Michigan. Again, refineries there that supply all of the jet fuel for the Detroit airport, for example, and all the home heating for the Hand of Michigan. And then through the St. Clair River into Ontario and ultimately Quebec. So if you live in any of those areas and you buy gasoline, then Line 5 is the source of your gasoline. And if you buy food, then just know that your farmers are drying their grain and heating their barns with propane that is produced from the fuel that comes down Line 5. About 30% of people in Ontario and Quebec have home heating that is propane sourced from Line 5. And there's 50,000 jobs on either side of the border that will be impacted if Line 5 is closed. If you fly out of Pearson Airport, all of the jet fuel there is a product that comes through Line 5. So I think it impacts all of us in various ways.
So you've been sounding the alarm bells for quite some time now. What are some of the things you've done? And now we should maybe just back up a bit. I guess we've explained what Line 5 is. Now let's explain what the potential issue is around Line 5 so our viewers understand.
Very good. Well, Governor Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan, has, over the last 3 years, tried every judicial trick to get Line 5 shut down. And she's issued an executive order that in May of this year, the line is to be shut down. So there is dispute from Enbridge, which is the company that owns the line. Federal treaty permitted that line to be in existence. And so a state doesn't actually have the authority necessarily to cause that line to shut down.
So what are some of the things you've been doing to just raise awareness around this issue?
Well, as you mentioned, I've done statements in the House and questions. There's been a petition, E3081, that had over 10,000 signatures on it, calling for Line 5 to stay open and for the government to act. And we really got the government at all levels engaged, including Seamus O'Regan, the Natural Resources Minister. And I've called on the Prime Minister to pick up the phone and call Joe Biden and get him to intervene in this dispute. The Prime Minister has indicated that he did raise the issue to President Biden. And so we've had a letter writing and emailing campaign to Governor Whitmer. You can get that on my webpage, mpmarilyngladu.ca. And all of these various efforts of the different construction trades on both sides of the border and the constituents that Governor Whitmer has in Michigan to basically raise the cry that this is an incredibly important line economically and energy-wise.
Sure. And we'll talk a bit more in the second segment when we come back from break about what are the issues. But the reality is this pipeline has been in play for 50, 60 years? It's been quite some time.
Absolutely, Dean. 68 years this pipeline has been in operation. There's never been an issue with it. And the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Safety Agency, and the state of Michigan verify this line annually. And there's been numerous upgrades to it. Right now, there's a tunnel project proposed that would completely encase the line so that there would take a very rare risk and make it negligible.
So we've got just a little over a minute left in this segment. So my question is this, Marilyn, you've been a part of the Sarnia-Lambton area for a long time. You're an engineer by trade. You've worked at Dow Chemical, Suncor. There's a bunch of different, your resume is quite lengthy in terms of the things that you've done. Talk to us about some of those jobs that relate directly in Sarnia. I mean, we talked about 50,000 jobs. Maybe we'll talk about some of the other ones when we come back, but let's talk specifically about your riding in Sarnia and what those jobs look like.
Right. So in Sarnia-Lambton, we have 6,500 in the construction workforce. 90% of those jobs are at the 3 refineries in town, Shell, Imperial Oil, and Suncor, as well as the downstream industry like Plains Midstream and Pembina that process Line 5 oil into propane and the other products. And so all of those jobs will be impacted. We're talking nearly 10,000 of those jobs. And then all the downstream service jobs that depend on the operation of those facilities for their livelihood. So 23,500 jobs is the estimate of what could be impacted just in Sarnia-Lambton between the petrochemical industry and, of course, the farming industry, which is our number 3 industry here.
Well, listen, when we come back for break, let's talk about more specifically what issue the governor has with this particular project. Welcome back to the Hill Update. Joining me on the show today is Marilyn Gladu, the Member of Parliament for Sarnia-Lambton. Marilyn, thanks for joining us on the show today. Now, just before the break, we started talking about, so why? Why are they trying to shut it down? We talk about all the jobs and what's going on. Talk to us, and we talk about safety and all those issues. Why are they trying to shut down a pipeline that provides so much economic benefit and energy security, all these things as we move forward? It seems a little bit puzzling.
Well, Governor Whitmer ran her election campaign on a promise to shut Line 5 down. She has been a climate activist for quite some time and is very anti-pipeline. And I think before she got in the job, she really didn't understand what would happen to her state if such a line went down. The reality is that we saw what happened in Texas over the holidays or in January when there was really cold weather and their utilities shut down. That would be what would happen to about 30% of her population in the upper hand of Michigan. The Detroit airport is very dependent on the Marathon refinery in Michigan, and also Ohio is going to have huge impacts. The Ohio governor has implied that he will be seeking damages if Governor Whitmer does shut the line down, because there's a huge amount of economic activity there. So I think she was unaware of the fact that there were these economic impacts, and at the same time, she was unaware of the amount of work that goes into verifying that line, and there have been no issues with that line in 68 years.
Well, I think that's one of the amazing things is that it has been proven to be safe. I know that we look at pipelines in general, a much safer way to do it. Not that rail doesn't work. Rail does work, but there's always an issue around derailments and stuff. I read somewhere that there was up to 65% of natural gas in the Upper Peninsula. You just talked about how important it was, and almost 55% in the state of Michigan. Is that, that to me, in terms of propane, that would be...
Those are accurate, absolutely accurate. And so that's why, this is an essential service.
Now, I also heard, and if you could verify this, you talked about the jet fuel for, obviously, Detroit Airport. What about Toronto? Would Toronto be affected as well as a result?
Yes, Toronto, 100% of the jet fuel comes from Sarnia-Lambton, and everyone driving their cars in Toronto would be similarly impacted. All the gasoline is coming from here, and it's produced from that fuel that comes down Line 5. There's not enough rail cars, there's not enough trucks to actually take the capacity. So, those aren't alternatives, and I would argue that they are not as environmentally sustainable and safe as the current line and the tunnel project that's proposed.
That's great. Well, I guess my next question would be, you talked about up to 50,000 jobs. I'm guessing that's on both sides of the border. What's the breakdown in terms of where those jobs would be specifically?
Well, in Canada, we're talking about the 23,500 in the Sarnia-Lambton area, and then another portion through Ontario and Quebec for propane producers and distributors, as well as farmers. Then in the U.S., we're talking about refinery jobs impacted in Ohio, Detroit, Wisconsin, and the downstream businesses that would service them in a similar way to the discussion we had about Sarnia.
So talk to us a little bit more about downstream. I don't think people appreciate the ancillary jobs that come, not just from refining, but from other products, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a bit more about what some of those downstream jobs look like as well?
Sure. If you have, let's say, for example, in my town, 10,000 well-paying jobs, those people are eating at restaurants. Those people are buying houses. They are consuming products in the area. They are going to events. Those companies are putting on luncheons, ordering in lunch, having overtime meals. And so the restaurant sector, the whole event and tourism sector really is dependent on that business. And so that's the downstream impact we're talking about, the service industries, the janitorial services, all of these various things that depend on those industries that are fed by Line 5.
Now we just got just under a minute left in this segment. Talk to me about some of the bigger companies like Dow and Suncor. Obviously, refining jobs. Would we be looking at a total shutdown, or would we be looking at massive layoffs? What would sort of be the impact there?
Well, all of the refineries are looking at what their alternatives are. And, it's worthy of note that with two increases to a carbon tax in the middle of a pandemic, there's a clean fuel standard that will add billions of dollars of cost. We've already got an uncompetitive environment here in Canada for refineries like Imperial Oil, Shell, and Suncor that are the three in my riding. Really, what can they do? Well, they could take more oil from barge. We could be buying Saudi Arabian, Venezuelan oil. We could reverse Line 9, which runs from the port in Montreal down to Sarnia, and we could bring Saudi Arabian, Venezuelan oil in that way. But, that's going to get us off Canadian oil, which
Marilyn,
is the
let's
most
hold that thought.
environmentally sustainable.
We come back for break. We'll finish that thought. Joining me on the Hill Update this week is Marilyn Gladu, the Member of Parliament for Sarnia-Lambton. Marilyn, before the break, we were just talking quickly about what some of the alternatives are in terms of where we bring oil from. I cut you off. I apologize. We're talking about oil from Saudi and some of these other countries. Do you just want to finish your thought there?
Absolutely. I mean, if we have to bring Saudi Arabian or Venezuelan oil in by tanker or through the reversal of Line 9 that runs from Montreal to Sarnia, that oil is going to replace Canadian oil. Canadian oil is the most environmentally sustainable oil produced. And so in addition to the human rights violations that we see in countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, you're talking about oil that's not as good for the planet as Canadian oil.
Well, one of the things I find always interesting as we talk to people is they really don't understand the huge regulatory requirements, what we look at in terms of emissions that quite frankly don't apply to oil that we bring in from other countries, right? That happens on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And as I spoke about the clean fuel standard that's being brought in, these are, extreme measures that don't apply to oil producers that are outside of Canada. So we've created a very non-competitive regime here in the country from a taxation point of view, from a regulatory burden point of view, and now, all the threats that we're seeing to the operation of Line 5.
All right, so what can be done? I mean, we got a May 12th deadline. You mentioned the governor in Ohio, who seems to be on your side. Talk to us about what the federal government's done, and have they done enough, in your opinion, and what more could be done? I mean, May 12th is going to arrive pretty quick.
Well, there have been the right words coming from the Prime Minister and the Liberal government saying that they're working on it. But of course, they were working on KXL right up until Joe Biden decided to cancel it, and they did nothing. So I don't think you can put your eggs all in that basket. I would say that Enbridge has petitioned in court and argued that the governor cannot overturn a federal treaty, that really needs to be heard in federal court. And the judge has ordered mediation on that issue, and she will hear arguments again, but she cannot hear them before June. So that will delay the executive order. And then I would imagine that they will find indeed that the federal courts need to hear it. At the same time, between the governor of Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that are also putting pressure on the governor of Michigan on this issue because of the economic impact that they will see, I think when states start fighting amongst themselves, it's incumbent on the president to intervene. And it's worthy of note that the President Biden was a senator at the time that the permit to allow Line 5 to be created was put into place, and he voted in favor of it at the time.
Talk about the tunnel. I know that the safety precautions that have gone in to deal with this issue that, stated by the governor. Would you just let people know, we're talking about a pipeline inside a tunnel that would create an added amount of certainty.
Right. I mean, right now, although there have been no issues in 68 years, the concern is what if something catastrophic happened and that oil leaked into the Strait of Mackinac, which is, a beautiful tourist and natural habitat area. The tunnel would go from the land side where the pipeline first enters into the strait, and would encase that whole pipeline all the way out to the other side. So that, even if there was a leak in the pipeline itself, it would never leak outside of the tunnel, and it would reduce the risk to absolute zero.
That's great. Marilyn, we've got about 30 seconds left. Any final words in terms of whether you feel optimistic on what's going on?
Well, it's essential that we keep fighting. And, I think the fact that the governor has approved 2 of the 4 permits for the tunnel project is a positive sign that she now recognizes the value of Line 5. And in light of what happened in Texas, it's my hope that reason will prevail and that either she will rescind the order or that President Biden will intervene, recognizing the economic benefit to both Canada and the U.S. to keep Line 5 open.
Well, listen, Marilyn, thank you for all your hard work. I know you've been a champion from day one when this became an issue, and we'll be watching closely as we move forward to that May 12th, at least that first date. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Good. Thanks, Dean, for having me and raising awareness on this issue.
Thanks. I think it's safe to say that the environment is very important when we look at any kind of economic activity. But I think it's also important to say that both the environment and the economy need to work hand in hand. We have a deadline of May the 12th. We'll see. That looks to me like that may come and go as courts are looking at these kinds of things. But we have to understand as well, there's a lot of jobs at stake here. And if we can do both, I think that's the best option in a situation like this. Thanks for joining me on the Hill Update.